Okay, so final session of the morning, we're going to finally get to the people that you absolutely love, and that is the Democratic field for the presidency. All of the people who think that they can or they should, and they might topple Donald Trump. But the first thing I want to do, and it picks up from what Larry was just saying, is not to deal with those who are in the race, but to ask the panelists about those who are not in the race and whether they think there's any possibility that they will join it. Mark Penn, Democratic pollster, recently threw a little bomb into the media discussion and suggested that possibly Hillary Clinton would be joining the race, possibly Mike Bloomberg, even possibly Michelle Obama. Karl, are any of these people possibilities, and what would be the impact?
No friggin' way. Look, the filing deadlines are coming up to get on the ballots in these states. We have November, December, and January to get organized before they start voting in Iowa. And if anybody thinks the Democrats are so stupid as to try and nominate Hillary Clinton again, they're kidding themselves. There is a limit to the number of times you need to be kicked in the head by a mule. And as to Mike Bloomberg, you know, every presidential election, Mike Bloomberg thinks about running, but never does, and there's a good reason why. His electoral appeal ends at the Hudson River. And you know, the idea that there's going to be somebody to come in and rescue us from this god-awful mess of candidates is just, you know, not going to happen.
Right.
You know, excuse me if my voice is terrible. Like, Mark Penn has a vested interest in Hillary Clinton running for president, and that is he has written that she would run.
And he hates her and wants to get her embarrassed a second time or
Yes.
third time.
And so he wants to be correct. Of course, he's not correct. I mean, there's one group of people who does not want Hillary Clinton to run, and that's the entire Democratic Party.
So, Kristen, does the fact that new names are thrown out there, how much does that reflect anxiety in the Democratic Party about the candidates? We'll talk about all of them individually, but in general, is the Democratic Party really worried about the array of people from whom they must choose?
I think there's a difference on this question between Democratic voters and Democratic activists in the establishment. I think in terms of Democratic voters, the answer is no, because many Democratic voters have not even tuned in yet. I did a focus group in a northern state not too long ago where I was talking to women who indicated in the focus group recruiting criteria that they intended to vote in the Democratic primary. And I asked them to do word association with the various candidates. What's a word that comes to mind when you think of Biden or Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren? And half of them barely knew who Kamala Harris was. And this is a point at which she was in the top 5 of the field. So there are many Democratic voters who are saying, I'm not going to worry about the state of this field or think about it until you have narrowed it down from the 24 people you are throwing at me. So I think that when it comes to voters, they're not necessarily panicked. They're actually just waiting to see how this shakes out. For the establishment, however, I think watching Joe Biden sort of give a very lackluster performance, paired with the fact that the other top 2 are either an avowed socialist, he embraces the term, or someone whose agenda lines up quite nicely alongside Bernie Sanders, does have some in the Democratic establishment quite concerned.
Right. I want to remind people that write down questions and hand them in because they'll all come to this iPad here, and I do want to ask the panelists your questions. So I'm sure that there are a lot of people in this room who are interested in the primary candidates. Do make sure that you get your questions in, and we'll attempt to answer them. This is a question for both Kristen and for Karl, and it's about polling. I mean, Karl, you and I were just briefly talking outside about how national polls are, you know, very difficult, are pretty much useless at the moment, and that the nature of the race changes as soon as Iowa happens and then New Hampshire happens. Can you just talk, and we will get onto the candidates, I promise you, about that process, about the way that the race changes because of the results that happen and how it affects polling?
Yeah, look, the polls are not completely useless. They sort of show us the state of the general attitude of Democrats. But let's not kid ourselves. Polling in a primary is very difficult to do, which is why this week we had one poll showing among Democrats nationwide, Biden up and another poll showing Warren up. And it's just, you know, are you doing adults? Are you doing Democrats? Are you doing Democrats and Democrat leaners? Are you doing people who actually have voted in Democrat primaries and adjusting for younger people who might not have been around long enough to have voted in the last primary? I mean, there are lots of technical questions that make it so. But look, what happens in those early primaries matters. And if you win Iowa, particularly if you win Iowa unexpectedly, you're going to get a bump. And if you're expected to win or dominate Iowa and you lose, you're going to be in trouble. Now, it's not to say the contest is over, but it does mean that the stakes get higher for you in the next contest. But in these first 4 elections that are going to be held in February, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, there's a tendency for the previous contest to have an impact on the subsequent contest. And it ain't always pleasant. I mean, we won in 2000, Bush won Iowa, and it didn't matter because New Hampshire likes to upset whatever Iowa does. And so John McCain whacked us by 16 points, or 19 points in New Hampshire, and we had to then fight back in South Carolina. Fortunately, we had 2.5 weeks to do so. But, you know, this contest is going to be affected. I'm interested more in what is the ground game of each candidate look like in Iowa, and what's their standing in Iowa polls, of which we've got a lot fewer than we have national polls, because that's going to have a big impact on the first wave of contests.
Well, go ahead.
There's generally some convergence these days about who the top 3 are. The top 3 in Iowa are the top 3 in New Hampshire, or the top 3 in South Carolina, are the top 3 nationwide. It's the ordering of those 3 that changes state to state. Elizabeth Warren looking pretty good in Iowa, Bernie Sanders looking pretty good in New Hampshire, Joe Biden leading the pack because of his strength with African-American voters in South Carolina. But you still have some alignment between the national polls, which show those 3 having pulled away from the Mayor Petes and the Kamala Harrises, and what you're also seeing in some of these states. You've got some blips where, like, I think Mayor Pete is slightly better off in New Hampshire, but ultimately the national polls and the state polls do show the same top 3. It's just the ordering of those top 3 that changes.
Right, right. So let's talk about the ground game in Iowa. Karl and Fred, I mean, who is doing it the right way? I mean, obviously Elizabeth Warren has gained about 30 points on Joe Biden since he got in, and he came in and he was immediately at the top. But in Iowa, that's the national. In Iowa, I don't know. Who's doing it right then?
Well, hard to say, because everybody's got numbers that they toss out. Here's my, I've got Elizabeth Warren has more people on the ground in Iowa supposedly than anybody else, and Mayor Pete has supposedly got good people and so forth. But here's the point: we really don't know, and that's going to be why this is sort of semi-exciting. But I only say semi-exciting. But look, Iowans take this seriously. 99 counties, you have to visit virtually every one of them. If you haven't visited every one of them, you need to explain why, and you have to go there several times. The only good news about Iowa is that if they make a commitment to you, they tend to be for you, and they stay until the last dog dies. In New Hampshire, they'll tell you they're for you. We had this guy, every time Bush would go to the state, this guy would show up and he'd say, "I'm for you. I love your mom and dad. I'm for you." And next time around, he'd say, "George, I'm sorry. I've been listening to McCain, and he's pretty good, and I'm just telling you, I'm for McCain now." And next time we'd go, he'd say, "George, you did a wonderful job in front of the Chamber of Commerce in Hillsborough. I'm for you now." Son of a bitch, the last time we went there, he said, "I'm for you," and we lost. But Iowa is going to have a disproportionate impact this time around because the field is so big, and there are going to be so many people that in the aftermath of it are not going to hit the 15% threshold for delegates, and we're going to watch out the Julian Castros and Tulsi Gabbards and et cetera, et cetera.
So Fred, what do you make of the fact that there is such a huge field of candidates? Does that just reflect the fact that a lot of people think that they can beat President Trump? Is it a good thing for the Democrats? I mean, how do you see the fact that it's such a huge field playing out?
There are a lot of people who want to be on television. And it's not just Republicans. Remember, Republicans had so many in 2016. It wasn't, which a lot of them were very average folks, and it helped Donald Trump to stand out rather easily. I think all we know about what's going on in Iowa is some people are getting a better press than others. And one person in particular is getting a great press, and that, of course, is Elizabeth Warren. The press has pretty much decided that they would like her to be the Democratic presidential candidate already. And, I mean, that can change if she somehow stumbles badly. But the way she would stumble would be because of this vast number of plans she has that cost an enormous amount of money and would enlarge and empower the federal government in ways that didn't happen even in the New Deal, and that would somehow strike members of the press to decide that, gee, maybe she's overdoing it. Well, they certainly haven't decided that yet.
Kristen, is that a wise decision for the media to have made, that Elizabeth Warren is a strong candidate?
Well, she's certainly getting very good press, and I think, you know, when we were introduced, she was sort of described by Larry as Hillary Clinton 2.0. I don't think she's exactly Hillary Clinton 2.0, even if perhaps there are ways, the way that she speaks, maybe that doesn't rub you the right way, or things like that that some people would complain about when it came to Hillary Clinton. But Elizabeth Warren does not have 30 years of baggage, of a large portion of the public just saying we'd had enough of her. So I don't underestimate Elizabeth Warren at all, and I don't think that it's just a media creation, but the fact that she has come to the race with this message of, I've got a plan. If you are a voter who feels like this is a very chaotic moment, and you are looking for someone to be a contrast with Donald Trump, who is, you know, freewheeling, he's kind of a wrecking ball. If you want someone who's going to be, I'm stable, I'm steady, and I have a plan, that's what Elizabeth Warren is selling. Now, the problem, as you mentioned, Fred, is the numbers, when they don't add up, suddenly it turns out that's not very stable. It's actually incredibly disruptive, the things that she wants to do. Right. But nonetheless, I think her message of, here's how I will contrast with Donald Trump most effectively, is what's helping her.
Right. Karl, you were saying I think you were saying yesterday that the way that Elizabeth Warren should be beaten or could be beaten is if you unpack what this particular policy means. The overall package seems to have considerable appeal, but in fact, do you think that she's very vulnerable because of the details?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think she's got good titles, but not very good substance, but you got to go out there and explain it. And for exactly the point that Fred put his finger on, do you really want the government messing around this much in your life? And do you really think these things will work out? Let me just say, Fred, you better be thinking carefully about what you're saying about Elizabeth Warren, or she's going to have a plan for you, my friend. She's going to have a plan for you.
Yeah, she strikes me as somebody who checks a number of boxes that the Democrats like to be checked. Like unfortunately for her, the Pocahontas box has obviously been unchecked. She doesn't have that, but she's a woman. And that, I think, is something that the Democrats really want to have on their ticket. In addition to that, she comes over as a wonk. She loves to present herself as a wonk, and that plays into the left and the Democrats' desire to feel smarter than their opponents. She's got a plan, she's got details, and she's wonkish, and she's a fighter. But perhaps one of the biggest advantages it seems to me that she has is that even though that she would be a fairly elderly president when sworn in, there are two guys who are older than her, and she's got a lot of energy and a lot of bounce. Karl, can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. But sometimes candidates have things that they think are strengths and their weaknesses. There's a reason why this woman is the least popular statewide elected official in Massachusetts, and that is, you put your finger on it. She got a plan. She is smarter than the rest of us. We are dumb. We need to be led. We need to be directed. We need to be forced to go in the right way. You know, some of you have made the mistake of having too much money. We'll take it away from you. You know, some of you have made the mistake of organizing a business or running a business. We'll take some of that responsibility off your shoulders and take it unto ourselves. I live in Austin, Texas, where she taught at the University of Texas at Austin Law School. This is the place where she filled out the application to get to Penn by indicating that she was of Native American extraction. There are people in Austin, friends of mine who are liberals, who love her, who were friends of hers when she and her husband were there in Austin. And she openly said to them, I'm going to do this because it'll give me points on my application to go to teach at Penn, because I will be a minority.
Right.
And they still love her. But there's something calculating about Elizabeth Warren that I think ultimately in a general election is going to be problematic. She is not an authentic person.
Right. Fred?
There's another way of putting this, I think, Carl, and that is that Elizabeth Warren has lived a lie for most of her adult political career. I can't think of a candidate for president ever, in my lifetime anyway, who has, by her own decision, lived a lie like this. That should be normally something that would eliminate you as a candidate, but I've talked to Democrats as well who say the same thing as they've told you, Carl.
Yeah, can I tell you a funny story?
Yeah, please do.
So Boone Pickens, T. Boone Pickens, a pal of mine, and one time we were up at the ranch shooting birds, and he said, do you know Elizabeth Warren? I said, he had an unusual experience with her. There's this liberal oil guy in Tulsa who calls up Boone and says, I'm nominating Elizabeth for the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. Will you second her nomination? If you seconded her nomination, it'd be a good thing, because I'm so liberal and you as a conservative, and she deserves to be in there. Boone says, well, I'll think about it. And the guy says, well, look, she grew up in Wetumpka, near you, where you grew up. And she comes from sort of the same background, and you ought to look into it. So Boone says, oh, Wetumpka. Well, okay, fine. I'll second the nomination. Shortly thereafter, she gets in the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, and shortly thereafter, the two of them run into each other. And she says, I want to thank you, Mr. Pickens, for seconding my nomination. He said, well, you grew up in Wetumpka, that little town. And Boone said, did you know Billy Bob Jones, who, a friend of mine? Oh, yeah, I knew him. Well, you must have gone to high school with him. They only had a 5-man football team, but they were the state champions in 5-man football. Oh, yeah, Billy Bob, he was just fantastic there on the all around. Everybody knew Billy Bob. Oh, he was a fantastic guy, wonderful guy. Shortly thereafter, Boone runs into Billy Bob and says, I was with your high school classmate, Elizabeth Warren. He said, hell, we went to elementary school together, but by middle school, she and her family had moved off to Oklahoma City, where she went to the Oklahoma Academy of Excellence, the only boarding school in the state. He said, I didn't go to high school with her. And Boone said to me, somebody who'd lie about going to Wetumpka High, you can't trust that son of a bitch.
So,
actually, he didn't say SOB, but anyway.
Kristen, when they've been asked, Democratic voters have said that in the past at least, have said that they think that Joe Biden has the best possible chance of beating President Trump. Compare him with Elizabeth Warren, and who has the better chance and why?
So I think Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren each would be making a play for a different piece of Trump's coalition. Joe Biden is the type of person where if you were a Republican who you did not like your choices in 2016, you weren't a big fan of Trump, but you just never could envision yourself voting for Hillary Clinton, maybe you broke for Trump, but someone like Joe Biden is someone you could stomach. Someone you could say, look, I feel like the chaos of the last few years, let's go a different direction. You could get Joe Biden. So I think more of perhaps the never Trump or the never quite warm to Trump Republican centrist coalition could be brought over to a Joe Biden, where they would be repelled by an Elizabeth Warren and her very progressive agenda. On the other hand, one of the other reasons why I think Elizabeth Warren is not Hillary Clinton 2.0 is she has that more populist edge to her message, that the big businesses, big corporations, they're coming for you, you're the little guy, I'm going to fight for little guys like you. Hillary Clinton could never credibly make that argument, that she was hanging out with little people and fighting for them. But Elizabeth Warren is going to try to make that a bigger piece of her argument. So if you don't like big pharma, if you don't like big banks, if you don't like big tech, Elizabeth Warren is making a big pitch to you. And so that's a very different piece of Trump's coalition, not the reluctant Republicans, but maybe some of those independents who are just more populist, they're not partisan. Can Elizabeth Warren win them over? I don't know for sure, but I know that that's more of where the weakness would be, where Biden would pull more from that kind of centrist group.
Carl, Joe Biden has always stressed his blue-collar credentials and, traveling by train to Delaware. And, there was a meme, I think, back when he was in the White House of him washing his Camaro in the White House Drive, and things like that, which was just kind of made fun of that aspect of him. Do you think that the scandal over Hunter Biden and the jobs in the payments for jobs that he is not qualified to do will tarnish that image? And how deserved do you think that how faulty do you think the image is?
Yeah, look, I think the image is enough that he could carry it through the general election. But the problem with the Burisma and Hunter and his get-rich schemes is that it's going to diminish in the general election matchups versus Trump, because the sort of the swing voter is going to say, well, you know what, he's sort of swampy and stinky, and he doesn't have a good explanation for it, and he's got a dreadful explanation for it. How dare you attack my family? My son deserved to get $600,000 a year for attending 2 board meetings of a company in a country he didn't know and in an industry he had no experience in. How dare you attack my family? So, I don't think that wears well. And so what I think it's an indirect problem for him in that it looks like it's diminishing the polling vis-a-vis Trump and removing the electability argument, as smart Democrats say, oh, he's mishandling that. Trump will chew him up on something in a general election, maybe not this issue, but an issue like it. And so it's undermining his electability, which is really his only saving grace. He has run a dreadful campaign. Yeah. And he has failed to raise money, and he has failed to spend it wisely, and his message is basically, it's a powerful message for the general election, I think. I'm semi-normal, and you'll be able to tolerate me for 4 years, but that ain't necessarily the message for the Democrats. You'll notice that Buttigieg and Klobuchar got some oomph after the last debate, by having gone in the debate after the nutty schemes of Sanders and Warren and saying, nice try, but that's a fairy tale, and you can't afford it. We can't afford it. And they've both gotten a small bump. They're sort of stealing the message that he should have emphasized more, in my opinion, which is, I'm the traditional Democrat, and you are way out on the fringe, and we can't afford these nutty schemes, and the American people won't trust our party if we nominate you.
Fred, sorry, go ahead.
There's one thing that I think is clear about Joe Biden, less so about Bernie Sanders, and that is that Joe Biden is too old. Now, we've seen over and over again a particular clue to this, and that is telling a story and mixing it up, and mixing up different parts from other stories over and over and over again. Now, what is this an indication of? I think it's indisputable that he is budding senility. Now, I know that's cruel to say. It hits people at different ages. We've all seen it. Many of us.
You and I felt that way when we were on the trail with FDR. I remember well in Cleveland, you turned to me and said, FDR, I think that boy's running out of gas. I was at 68 with Johnson in New Hampshire. I can't remember.
I covered both of those campaigns.
Yeah. But Fred, sorry, you have actually been covering these things for so much longer than such a long time. It's always struck me that Joe Biden was a very weak candidate. I mean, in previous campaigns, his polling was sort of just within the margin of error. It might therefore have been 0. He's always been weak, and as far as muddling things up, he's always made things up. Mm-hmm. And, plagiarism and from a really hapless Labour leader in Britain, Neil Kinnock, has been part of what he's done. So didn't he come into this race just sort of riding on the fumes of the Obama administration, and he had name recognition but not very much else?
Well, that's certainly part of it, and it turns out that in the Democratic Party, and I think these candidates are the Democratic Party. When people in the press write about, they have the candidates here, and then there's the Democratic Party, and then there are the voters. These people are the Democratic Party, and they, poor Biden really doesn't have a message that resonates with this Democratic Party. I don't think he knows what his message is, except that he'd like to be president. And going back to Obama, the Obama administration is a disappointment to this Democratic Party. They thought he should have done more. I'll have to give Republicans credit for stopping him from doing that and forcing him to use executive orders, most of which President Trump has already eliminated.
So, Kristen, a question from the audience, and it's just the ultimate question about Biden. Can he pull it out? Can he succeed? Or is the trajectory now, is he pretty much doomed?
So what's funny is that the media narrative around Biden is that he's doomed, and the polls are actually not showing that. The polls have shown him pretty stable, around 30% nationwide, for quite some time. And so in the same way that people are always trying to find, well, is this going to be the thing that dooms Trump? And nothing is ever dooming Trump. This is the thing that's going to doom Biden, and yet Democratic voters seem to be somewhat impervious to it. Because the core of folks that really like Joe Biden tend to be African-American voters in South Carolina, for instance, who don't have somebody else that they see in the field who they like, who they feel is credible, who they have moved to. So as much as the media narrative around Joe Biden is that he has been in decline, I frankly think that some of that is the wish casting that people wanting to see Elizabeth Warren rising to the top of the field. And I don't know that it's totally borne out in the data. But to Karl's point, he does need a message. Besides, I've done a lot of things, I've been in politics forever, and I'd really like to be president now. And I think that it's bizarre that he spent so much of the early days of the campaign trying to position himself as someone who was very, very progressive, when his record was never going to match up to that. You may recall his sort of strange flip-flop back again on the Hyde Amendment. The piece of legislation, or the rule that says that no federal funds can go toward abortion. As Catholic, as someone who had sort of said, look, even though he's pro-choice, he had always been in support of the Hyde Amendment. Many of the other Democratic candidates were coming out opposing it. He could have taken that as a moment to say, look, I'm pro-choice, but you all want to spend tax dollars on abortion, and I don't think that's right. And instead, he had this sort of mushy flip moment that just put him down in the pack instead of him distinguishing himself as someone who could be different for a more moderate type of Democrat.
Yeah. Karl, I want to get to this sort of mushy moments and blunders, verbal blunders of Biden. I remember, I can't remember.
I'm sorry, but my time is up.
That is exactly the one that I was going to come to. There was a debate where he said, my time is up. You've run successful campaigns. When I saw that, I thought, God, the people in his campaign must be tearing their hair out. I mean, obviously you tore your hair out at some point in your...
I did not participate in the act. It decided to leave naturally. I used to have a lot of it, and it was not gray, but I went to work in the White House for 7 years.
But was that the worst moment for Biden? That was a terrible moment for his campaign, surely.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I'm with Kristen. I don't count him out yet. The question is, in the next 90 days, can he sort of say to himself, I'm going to go out there and say, I'm a traditional Democrat, and these are nutty schemes that are being proposed over here, and I'm going to get things done. I thought one of his better moments was to say, look, I'm the guy who passed the assault weapons ban. I did this. You can all talk about it, but I got it done, and I'll get things done. But he's got to come across as a traditional Democrat, and two other things have got to happen. Elizabeth Warren can't be allowed to consolidate the left. Bernie Sanders has to have a moment of rebirth and re-energizing, and I think that's going to naturally happen. Look, down when he goes to Iowa, he's got a better handle to make the argument. The Iowa Democratic Party is divided into groups. There are the nuts who are like in Johnson County, home of the University of Iowa, and then there are blue-collar union types who are a good constituency for him, and then there are just sort of centrist Midwestern Democrats. He's got the ability to grab a bunch of those people, but he's got Amy Klobuchar can't get above a certain level. Mayor Pete can't get above a certain level. But more important than that, the nuts need to be divided between Bernie and Elizabeth.
Right.
And he's got to be able to try and consolidate some of the more traditional Midwestern Democrats behind him.
Fred, I want to get to discuss Bernie. One of the things that struck me is that, obviously in 2016, although he didn't win, and I think most of us thought he never was going to win, he nevertheless moved the discussion, moved the Democratic Party, and he moved the party to a much more left-wing position. What's happened since then, it seems to me, is that the party has, because he's moved it, it's caught up with him, and he's lost his marginal advantage ideologically. Elizabeth Warren, although she says she is not a socialist, nevertheless, as you have said, lines up very closely to him. So can he take those people who support the policies that he introduced to the party, but which other people have now taken over?
You know, I doubt if he can. I agree with your description of what he's done, and it's amazing. He certainly showed the attractiveness in the Democratic Party of really hard left-wing ideology. He's the champion of it, and he's made the most of it. I've always thought that Bernie Sanders is a very boring candidate. He's not interesting to listen to anymore. I first covered him when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont. And I traveled, I was with the Baltimore Sun newspaper then, and I traveled up to Burlington and to do a piece on him. And I thought, well, gee, this guy's a socialist. He says he's a socialist. At the very least, he'll be very interesting to talk to and write about. He wasn't at all. It was just straight ideology, and I forget what he'd done in Burlington. It wasn't interesting. And he's had an amazing career doing this. I guess I'm not an expert on Bernie Sanders because I never would have predicted that he would have gotten this far, and he's gotten awfully far. But I think, in Joe Biden's words, his time is up.
Yeah. You know, the one thing he did do, though, was get 47% of the vote against Hillary and demonstrate that at least among the activist participants in the primary process, there was a thirst for this left, which I think everybody in the Democratic primary thought this time around faced the question of what do we do about it? And the answer of most of them, including Biden, is to move to the left.
Right.
So we have a collective move. I mean, you know, think about it. Medicare for All is co-sponsored by every member of the Senate who is in the race for the Democratic nomination. And the Green New Deal has been praised as aspirational by virtually everybody over there. So you take a look at reparations. I mean, we got, I think we have 5 of the last dozen are in favor of reparations or a consideration of it. So the entire Democratic primary has moved to the left, which is odd in one respect because it's not where a bunch of Democrats, particularly in South Carolina and in Iowa, maybe a little bit in New Hampshire, but not in Nevada. I mean, in Nevada, it's going to be very interesting to watch. Third contest. The Culinary Union is sitting on the sidelines. Powerful organization. If you work in Las Vegas, you generally tend to be, and you're a craps dealer or waitress, or you work in the kitchen, or you work on a hotel staff, you're generally a member of the Culinary Union. And why? Because they say, if you'll join the union, we have the best private health care plan you could ever imagine for you and your family. And they're opposed totally to Medicare for All. So this is the kind of place where if a Joe Biden said, you know what, with me, I'm going to protect your gold-plated health care plan that is the only thing that allows you to attract your members, and by God, stand with me, then he could conceivably have a chance against this sort of leftward swing of the Democratic Party.
The only other thing that I can think that would be something that could help Bernie Sanders have this sort of moment where he holds off the Elizabeth Warren challenge is if she begins trying to fashion herself an off-ramp from some of these pretty far-left ideas, the things about eliminating all private health insurance. She's been pressed on this in debates, and she's sort of stood firm and doubled down on this position that I think when it comes to a general election, she's going to have to try to find a way to jettison. So if she begins building herself those off-ramps, can Bernie Sanders then say, you don't want generic, you want name brand. They've all come around to this later, but I'm the original formula. I'm the one you want.
Very smart observation. And Bernie's already picked up on this. It was not an accident that last week he said, she says she's a capitalist. I'm not. I mean, he's starting to set this up. Republicans ought to be helping this drama along a little bit by saying, well, attacking the Democrats for the excesses and saying, well, who among you is not with that? or picking out something where she has a difference from Bernie and saying, well, he's a nut on this, but at least Elizabeth is semi-sensible on this. We need to find clever ways to, in the public debate, begin to make them answer for each other.
I have just a little story about Bernie. He and his wife were once my guests at a dinner, and I was expecting the egalitarian shtick and the ordinary guy, and I don't know if I've ever had two guests who seemed more entitled and seemed to think that they were doing me a favor by coming to dinner with me. They're not the sort of egalitarians that you would think.
Look, in the Senate, he had no friends because he was a grumpy, disagreeable bastard who sat in the corner of the Senate. I mean, literally, he would sit in the corner of the Senate cloakroom, drinking coffee and reading the newspapers. And that's where he was. You never saw him on the floor. You go watch that floor on C-SPAN if you got a particular political addiction and can't help yourself. But they're always palling up with each other. You never saw Bernie because nobody liked him, and that's because he didn't like any of them.
So let's talk about Beto O'Rourke.
Robert Francis O'Rourke.
Sorry, I knew I was going to get corrected on that. Because he seems in some way, although, again, he's not a candidate who seems to be a remote chance of winning or even coming second, third, or fourth. But to some extent, he's doing what Bernie did in 2016. Actually, the cover of the Washington Examiner magazine, which went to press on Thursday night, has a picture of Beto O'Rourke driving the wagon leftward with all of the candidates on it. He is saying things which probably are angering the Democrats because they don't want them said out loud, but he's talked about taking charitable status away from churches which don't subscribe to the secular ideology that they have. He talked about taking AR-15s away. Is he doing to the party what Bernie did in 2016, which is to say moving it left? Anyone? Fred?
No, I don't think he really has any. I mean, look, it's pretty hard to move to the Democrats any further to the left, and they're not listening to him. Look, I think I'm trying to think of an example of what's happened to Robert Francis that has happened to an earlier candidate, and I know it has. I just can't think of who that is or another politician.
Are you saying he's inconsequential?
What he's saying now? No, it'll help Republicans. I mean, a lot for. Most getting rid of the tax advantage of churches. I mean, getting rid and start taxing them, and even worse, confiscating people's guns. We haven't heard the last of that, Carl.
No, Carl, when he said
that stuff, we're going to hear a lot
why
more.
Why are we wasting time on this buffoon?
No, but because of what he's doing with Chuck Schumer came out immediately and said,
yes. Of course we're not going to do that.
Of course we're not going to do that. But in fact, you look at the record, the Democrat, he's saying the things that will expose what Democrats really believe.
Well, look, he's just shooting off his mouth. Here's what the point I was trying to make and was getting at it very slowly, and that is that he was the golden boy with that great run for governor of Texas, and he defeated Cruz, which actually, he lost to him by 3 points or 4 points, and that did not dent his image. I mean, Cruz, probably the most disliked man in the Republican Party, and yet he came close, and he was the golden boy. And then he gets running for president, and that's shattered. And he has had a hard time adjusting to his new status, which is not much.
Yeah, look, he made the mistake of believing his own press clippings.
Indeed.
And he ran a lackluster race, but Cruz ran a non-existent race. Mm-hmm. And he let him get away with all this left-wing garbage without drawing the attention of the people of Texas to it. But yet he thought he was a golden boy because he came in within 2.6%. And then, of course, he went off to find himself. Wandered around America for 6 weeks or so. But I mean, got out his atlas and sort of said, what are some interesting towns that I can go to and see how good a hamburger I can find, and find an opportunity to do my skating in some parking lot. I mean, he's a nut, and it is a sign of the desperate straits the Democratic Party is in, that there was this brief moment in January and February when everybody was thinking that this guy had the great capacity to be the next big thing. But, you know, we're wasting time on him.
Well, let's move straight on from here.
Let's talk to Yang or Tulsi Gabbard. They're more consequential than this guy is.
Kristen, speaking of desperate straits, I have there's a question here from the audience, which I'll just read verbatim. Do you feel the voter turnout of the Democrats will be down due to the quality of candidates and their lackluster performance?
I don't think so. I think this is going to be a main event, main attraction thing where every Democrat is going to want to participate, because think about the variety of candidates you have. You may overall think that the field is subpar, but somewhere in there is someone who's got something you might like. And there's a real belief on the Democratic side that you have to get this right, because for them, defeating Donald Trump is the prime directive. That is the number one thing they want done. So sitting it out and letting their fellow Democrats go to these caucuses and polls while they stay home and just watch it on the news, I don't think you're going to see. And you don't have to look at polls to see that. You can look at voting actual turnout from the last midterm. Democratic voters are fired up. They know where their polling place is, and they like going there. And they're not going to stay home, I think, during this primary. Even if on the balance they think the candidates are perhaps not great, if there's one that they like and they think they can save their party by putting that person a little further ahead, I think they're going to turn out.
Primaries are a process of delusion. We sort of talk ourselves into thinking that person's going to be great, and you know, that's what we pick the right person and they're perfect. But the other thing that's driving this is you look at these enthusiasm levels, and people have in October of 2019 enthusiasm levels that we would tend to see towards the end of October 2020. And it's slightly higher for the Democrats and Republicans, but essentially statistically insignificant. But people are ready to vote. And the turnout next year in both the primaries and the general elections are going to be record setters for the modern era.
Here's another audience question. Can the Democratic Party candidate credibly tack back to the center enough to challenge Trump? And the second part of this, or does he win in a landslide? Fred.
What, Trump win in a landslide? I don't think so. I think Trump is going to have great difficulty winning re-election. He certainly can, but it won't be a landslide. And there are things he could do that I think would make him a stronger candidate, and he's not doing them. I kind of wish the general was back as his chief of staff. That might help a lot. But it looks like you only get about a 4-month time as chief of staff, and then Trump declares independence, and you have to leave. But I think Trump is in trouble, and even a bad Democratic candidate potentially could beat him.
Karl.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the general election in a panel this afternoon, but I want to say this about this is the Richard Nixon theory. He once famously posited it and constantly gave this as advice to candidates. If you're a Republican, tack right in the primary and tack back to the center in a general election, and conversely, if you're a Democrat, tack to the left in the primary and come back to the center. That assumes nobody's watching. You know, the problem for anybody in the modern era, at least, of tacking to the fringe on the primary and coming back to the general elections, we all watch them, particularly in this process. We'll be watching. By the time we get to July of next year when the candidates are nominated, we will have been watching this process for 14 or 15 months in a way that has been unusual for the modern era, and we'll know where they are. So it's going to be difficult for if a Democrat, this is why they've got a problem for the general election that we'll talk about later, but you cannot tack to the fringe and then try and move back to the center without damaging the thing that is most critical in a general election for president, which is the sense of you as an authentic individual who actually believes the thing that you say. Right. And it's going to be a problem if they try and tack back.
This an audience question specifically for you, Kristen, is just, do you believe the polls are credible?
That's a great question. I think that you should always be a thoughtful consumer of polls, meaning take them with a grain of salt. Don't let any one individual poll you see reported on the news stand as the gospel truth, because even a poll that is done perfectly, done with excellent methodology, gold standard type work, even in those situations, every once in a while, just the way random sampling works, you're going to get a weird one. So don't take any one individual poll as the thing to live or die on. As Karl mentioned, you take individual polls in the Democratic primary right now, and they're a bit all over the place. CNN says Joe Biden's at 30. Monmouth says Elizabeth Warren's in first place. Emerson College uses a strange methodology where Yang keeps winding up at like 6 and 7%. So different institutions all use different methodologies, and that can lead to different results. The thing I would point out, though, is a lot of people came away from 2016 feeling very burned about the polls, and for good reason. The way they were reported on sort of suggested, well, Hillary Clinton's going to win, and then she obviously didn't. But the thing to bear in mind about national polls is that that's not how we elect presidents. It's not how we choose nominees. It's not how we elect, ultimately, who goes to the White House. The national polls were actually closer in 2016 than they were in 2012. They showed Hillary Clinton winning by 2 to 3 points. She wound up winning the popular vote. That's just not how we pick presidents. There were a handful of states where the polls were off catastrophically because they weren't sampling enough people without college degrees. The industry has fixed that. We now are sure that we're sampling enough people based on education levels. However, what we don't know is what we don't know. What we don't know is what is the interesting variable that's really going to drive vote behavior that perhaps we're missing. And so I don't think the polls are broken beyond repair. They were pretty good in the midterms. They told us what was going to happen, and what happened is what happened. But still be cautious in 2020. Don't let any headline or news segment that oversells one particular poll drive your view of what's going on out there.
Really getting difficult to do quality state-level polls because the cost of polling is being driven up. And it's being driven up by a weird federal law. We're more and more, how many of you have a landline that you actually answer? I do when everybody comes to the gate and punches the button and says, I'm here. That's the only time I answer my landline. So we're all on cell phones, right? So you have to have a survey in which 60, 65, 66, 70% of your instruments are conducted on cell phones. Federal law allows an auto dialer to be used for landlines. So if you get they have a machine that dials your phone number, and when you pick it up, your name and so forth pop up on a screen in front of somebody who asks you the questions. Can't use an auto dialer for cell phones. So some poor guy or gal is back there in the back dialing your cell phone number, and you look at it and say, I don't know this number, I'm not answering. And they have to keep dialing. So the cost of surveys is going up because it's a hell of a lot cheaper to have a machine dial and immediately pop it up in front of a screen than to have somebody punching in 10 digits and hoping to God you answer the phone call. So getting more and more difficult. And we're going to models. And everybody now is modeling the electorate, which has got some strengths and weaknesses to it as well. I was on a panel the day before the 2016 election with Jim Messina, co-chairman of the Hillary Super PAC. And the moderator was sort of a snooty liberal and said, do you think Trump has a chance of winning? I said, yeah, I got a chance, and he's going to do well in these states and blah, blah, blah. But he's got to break the blue wall, and that gets to be difficult. She said, well, put a number on it. I said, well, I don't want to put a number on it. She said, put a number on it. I said, well, 30% chance. Turns to Messina. Messina says, last night we used 5 billion pieces of data to conduct 68,000 simulations of the election, and Hillary won 92.7% of them. She's going to be elected president tomorrow. So the moderator turns back to me and says, would you like to change your number? I said, yeah, 40%. But Kristen is right. You got to be very cautious about this. That's why I like to look at averages and see where people are coming from, and also look at the quality of the underlying poll at the state level. But at the state level, we don't have, I mean, at least you've got enough that you can form a dependable average at the national level, whether they're good polls, great polls, or middling polls. But at the state level, it's a hell of a lot different.
Fred, you're going to get the last word.
I just want to add something about polls. You know who they have the most nefarious impact on? Reporters and columnists and people covering the race. Believe me, I've after written on campaigns for a long time. It's hard to write a piece about how great you think some candidate is who's not way up in the polls. And reporters and the people covering campaigns are so affected by that, by the poll numbers, that you need, if you want to get a lot of favorable coverage, you need to be high in the polls, as weak as they are, as Karl has said.
Yeah, you had that problem. You wanted to cover that 60 race, and Seward was leading in the polls, and nobody would pay attention to your man Lincoln.
With that tribute to the Fred's long-standing history of covering politics, we're going to have to draw it to a close. We're going to be actually talking about President Trump's chances this afternoon in general, but for now, it's time to close. Please give the panel your appreciation.
Well done, gang. It's the gang of four. All right, it is lunchtime. I don't have a joke about that. I wish I did, but